Good morning, all. This is a great day, at least for some of us. We're very happy to being able to arrive here. It has been a kind of like difficult and long journey, but we are very, very excited that we could put together this event. My name is Daniel Ibanez. I'm here also with Nikos Katsikis, and together with Daniel Daoud, that I don't see you right there, Ali Fard, that is also right there, Tarane Mescani, and Pablo Perez Ramos right there. All of us Doctor of Design students, we would like to welcome you all to the 2014 DDes conference entitled Projective Views on Urban Metabolism. We will do now a quick introduction that we will play a little ping pong between Nikos and me, so hopefully we will set the table for the conference today. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you all for coming here. Over the past decade, we feel that there have been widespread efforts to reposition design in relation to a changing and expanding context. The redefinition of this context, however, has proven a very serious challenge, not only because the complexity of the urban environments is actually increasing, but because there is a need to move the agency of the design outside of its traditional locus, let's say the city, and try to grasp the expanding social, environmental, and economical influence and interdependencies of urbanization across the Earth. So, what is the context to which we as architects, landscape architects, and urban designers are supposed to respond to? Is it still the immediate building site, the traditional urban core, the suburban expansions of the city, the increasingly urbanized polycentric regions, or should it try to grasp the extended operational landscapes, as we like to call them, of urbanization? Should it try to grasp the vast zones of food production, resource extraction, energy production, the systems of dams, hydrological systems, reservoirs, the logistical spaces of trade and circulation, the landscapes of waste disposal? So, in what has been characterized as a condition of generalized urbanization, urban metabolism has gained influence as a concept promising to interweave this multiplicity of context, supplanting the limitation of fixed categories and unproductive binaries, like the city and countryside, the urban and not urban, the natural and the social. We feel that it offers a lens to understand the continuous processes of energy, material, and population exchange within and between cities and their extensive hinterlands, thus grasping the complex dynamics of urbanization processes. And already, during the last decades, urban metabolism has gained importance as a subject to both extensive empirical research and critical discussion within the natural and social sciences. However, these approaches, we feel, have been largely biased between what we could call more techno-scientific quantitative ones that are mostly limited to a performative interpretation of flows, like, for example, the modeling of footprints, the modeling of inputs and outputs of cities, or even buildings, and more critical ones attempting to interrogate the social and political dimensions of metabolic processes, as best exemplified by the growing scholarship on urban political ecology.
So, at the same time, the design disciplines have often realized the potentials emerging from an understanding of urban metabolism in shaping concepts, models, and spatial strategies. For example, the Geddes Valley section that aimed to define the territorial configuration of socio-ecological relations, and its, for example, post-war interpretations by the Team 10, or Buckminster Fuller's attempts to reinvent design as a means of managing flows through his regenerative techno-scientific utopias. However, today, this engagement with questions of urban metabolism is becoming increasingly challenging, at least for designers. On the one hand, metabolic relations which were historically confined at the regional scale are exploded today across sites and scales. On the other hand, while apparently more and more absorbed into the space of flows, they are still deeply interwoven with territorial transformations in land use systems, settlement typologies, and operational infrastructures. Within this context, design discipline has mostly been fascinated by the need to orchestrate the fluidity of metabolic processes, privileging notions of adaptability, and ignoring the often sclerotic nature of the urban fabric. Or they have been overly concerned with questions of performance and efficiency as part of the broader sustainability paradigm. Therefore, a more projective approach to urban metabolism could offer a more elaborate understanding of the relations between organizational models and the formal and physical specificities of spatial structures across scales. An understanding that could address the design of space not simply as a question of how to best facilitate or adapt to patterns of metabolic flows, but as a way to unveil the underlying complexities and suggest alternative, more synthetic, socio-ecological environments. We would like also to point out that in our immediate context around here, urban metabolism has been an important part of various agendas in and around the Graduate School of Design. For instance, Robert Frost, the father of the discipline of industrial ecology, from where an important part of urban metabolism research has derived, is a senior associate at the Harvard Kennedy School. Also, recently, Harvard University, in collaboration with MIT and Boston University, have started a major long-term research project funded by the National Science Foundation entitled Ultra X, which aims to track the urban metabolism of the city of Boston. The conference also reflects the increasing interest on the topic within the GSD various faculty members and students from all departments embracing the concepts in various manners. Moreover, it coincides with an exciting moment for collaboration and innovation across the university, since the Dean Mohsen Mostafavi, in association with the Innovation Lab at Harvard, has recently launched a 50,000 design challenge where one of the 4 topics is precisely urban metabolism. So hosting this event here at the GSD not only allows us to touch upon all these agendas, but also offers us the rare opportunity to construct a truly interdisciplinary platform bridging various dialogues and even contrasting perspectives on the topic.
Okay, so I will just give you an overview of what's going to happen today. The conference is structured around 3 panels. We have 1 morning panel and 2 afternoon ones. The first panel, we call it Metabolic Upscaling, will aim to actually try to map the contemporary condition of metabolic upscaling and its challenges. It's going to be the more theoretical of the 3, but we feel it's extremely fundamental for allowing us to reframe the question of urban metabolism in the best possible way. This will get us until 12:30. We actually have 4 speakers in the first panel and 3 in every one of the next. So in 12:30 we break for 1 hour for lunch. We reconvene at 1:30 with the 2 afternoon panels, which are closely related to design questions. The first one is going to address territorial transformations and map new territories for design in and beyond the city. And the third one, it's going to actually try to unpack the agency of design and, let's say, map alternatives for the future of the discipline. At this point, I would also like to highlight that this topic and mostly the structure and the questions, the problematic of this conference, it's very directly related to the upcoming issue of the New Geographies Journal, which is edited by Daniel Banyes here and myself. It's called Grounding Metabolism, and it's going to be published in May. It's going to be the first out of 3 series that are going to be edited by a new group of doctoral students. So all of us that we are organizing the conference are also the future editors of these three issues. So stay tuned for updates regarding that. Somewhere around May, we will let you know again.
So before obviously starting with the first speaker and the first panel, we would like to thank like numerous individuals and organizations to have this event possible, and that's a mandatory thing to do, especially in this conference that has been, as I was saying, like quite challenging. Obviously, first of all, I would like to thank the Advanced Study Program for, let's say, sponsoring this Doctor of Design conference this year. In particular to Barbara Elfman and Maria Moran for their support. I would like to have a special mention to Antoine Picon and Martin Veschol, directors of our program, that they have not only support as directors itself, but also from their personal, let's say, research funds to make this event possible. I would like to have a particular thank you to the Urban Theory Lab and his director, Neil Brenner, that his support has been fundamental as well to have this amazing panel and this amazing list of speakers with us. Same with Kiel Mo and Jane Hatton and the Energy and Environment Lab for their amazing support, as well as the New Geographies Lab and Hasim Sarkis. I would like to mention also two departments at the school, the Department of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, that has been crucial as well to make this possible. And finally, the Urban Metabolism student group, as well as the GSD events department, with particular mention to Ben Prosky, Chantel Blakely, Ronnie Sharoff, and Sohali Sutaria, that was very helpful as well on organizing all this. And finally, and probably the most important, I would like to thank our speakers today for making, all the way to here, especially some of you that has come from far away. So we are extremely happy of having you all here. So without further ado, I would like to present our first speaker of this morning. His name is Jason Moore. We have it here, professor of world history in the Department of Sociology in Binghamton University. He's a world systems theorist interested in discussing recent approaches to socio-spatial relations that try to transcend the society-nature divide. Please join me in welcoming Jason Moore.
Thank you, and thank you especially to Danny, Pablo, Nikos for organizing this, and Neil for being an inspiration over many years to be as rigorous a geographer as one possibly can. All right, so we shall begin with the question, metabolic rift or metabolic shift. And let's see, make sure I can get this right. All right, so today one of the most important critical traditions in global environmental studies is that of the metabolic rift. Originally formulated by John Bellamy Foster in the late 1990s as a way to bring nature back into historical materialism in a way that was distinct from Jim O'Connor's earlier effort to bring nature into political economy. And inherent in Foster's original formulation, and indeed a problem that runs across both mainstream and critical approaches to global environmental change, is a tension between the realization that humans, yes, indeed, are a part of nature that registers philosophically, and then a practical analytical acceptance of a nature-society dualism as two independent systems in our everyday analyses. So the great question is, how do we ford that divide in a way that puts the philosophy of humanity in nature to work in our analytical frames, our methodological premises, our narrative structures, and so forth? So in Foster's presentation of Marx's ecology, he saw there was really this tension between Marx's relational holism, a monist approach to humans and the rest of nature, to borrow one of the phrases that Marx and Engels enjoyed very much, and the ontological dualism of modernist thought. So sorry, I moved us in the wrong direction. Two souls, we therefore have really two souls of the metabolic rift over the past 15 years, and one of which dominates today. That is the view of a disruption in the exchange between social systems and natural systems. That is nature plus society. Nature plus society equals what? Well, that question is unresolved and is unresolvable within a Cartesian separation of humans from the rest of nature encaged within a society-nature formulation. So there was a tension, however, within the way that Foster approached it, and a difference between how Foster approached the question of metabolism and historical change relative to how many of his students have engaged this. And this tension was that early on, Foster very much saw his reconstruction of historical materialism as if nature mattered, dialectically bound to his frequent collaborator's argument, Paul Burkett's argument, that value was, in Marx's sense, value as abstract social labor, was dialectically joined to the production of nature. And in this, Foster said something that he never said, he's never really said subsequently, which is that value, in Marx's sense, allows us to trace capitalism's fundamental contradiction to the alienation of nature and the alienation of human production as two sides of a singular contradiction. But it proved a lot more difficult to put this to work because our methodological premises, our theoretical frames, our narrative structures are all so deeply embedded within a Cartesian dualism that it becomes very difficult to move beyond this, because we need a conceptual vocabulary that links the two apparently dissimilar domains of the human and the extra-human as a unified field. So despite Foster's learning this, getting the ropes of this system here. Despite Foster's view that we have a singular process, the co-production of nature and commodity production and exchange and the accumulation of capital, he took this phrase from Marx that's been so frequently quoted about an irreparable rift in the social metabolism, as meaning the metabolism of nature and society. And this really poses two closely related questions. First, is this what really Marx really meant by the phrase social metabolism? I think that there are good reasons based on the reading of a close reading of Marx's corpus that Marx had a dialectical and relational ontology of humans and the rest of nature. And the other question is simply, is this the best way to reconstruct a history of capitalism, of course, as a rich, multi-layered totality of many determinations? That's really the big question, can nature plus society get us to where we need to go, or do we need an understanding of capitalism as what I call world ecology that we'll touch on later in this lecture? That is a conception in which capitalism is the co-production of nature, the accumulation of capital, and the pursuit of power, not as these three concept boxes like we see in systems models, but rather as a dialectical totality. That's why in Danny's kind introduction, I always say, well, I'm not a world systems theorist because I'm not interested in systems. I'm interested in relations of power and production and reproduction in the web of life. And I think that what's often gotten lost in the global environmental change literature is that it's become dominated by a systems model that is interactionist rather than dialectical. And I'll try to get to at least provide a few hints of what I mean over the course of this brief talk. But the simple point would be to say that in systems models, the parts do not acquire new properties in the process of becoming a totality. And that's very much what we see in both major global metabolic metabolism approaches today, both that of Fischer-Kowalski and her colleagues at the Institute for Social Ecology in Austria, and Bellamy, Foster, Richard York, Brett Clark, that wing of the metabolic rift argument, where capitalism is essentially untouched through the process of reshaping nature, so there's no co-production process. And of course, this means that capitalism, modernity, pick your favorite term, is ontologically prior to the web of life. So there's a lot of confusion that's generated here because this process of the metabolic rift between nature and society, the way that it's talked about, dresses up a set of interaction effects as dialectics. And so often we talk about a nature-society dialectic. I would suggest that, at least in Marx's term, that's not a dialectic, because dialectics have to involve asymmetries, and they have to evolve a process of historical evolution and transcendence. So capital, labor, town and country, empire and colony, so on and so forth. Nature society does not, calling it a nature society dialectic doesn't help us very much, in part because for all the use of the term, although philosophically it's been problematized, analytically nature and society still pretty much remain untouched. The great loosener of dialectics, that's Boskar's wonderful turn of phrase, is rarely to be seen, especially in the global environmental change literature, which I think ends up being, even in its so-called Marxist or critical dimensions, I think ends up being quite functionalist and positivist. So this is really the question of how are we going to conceive metabolism as a singular or dualistic process. I would say that instead that the difficulty of starting with nature and society is that you continually look at what each other does, what one acting unit does to another acting unit, and you lose sight of how the relations form and reform the overall process of metabolic flows, of the relations of power, of production and reproduction, ideas of nature, and so on and so forth. So I would say instead of looking at a rift and a separation, we need to look at shifting configurations. We need to look at the relations that form and reform and eventually, historically and geographically, undo themselves. And I realize that this is pitched at a fairly high level of abstraction, so I will direct you to some of my other work in the emerging world ecology framework that you can find on my website. And Danny and Nikos very persistently got me to write something for their new geographies issues, so we'll have this as well to help sort of ground some of this. So in sum, I think we are better served by a perspective that says metabolic shift rather than metabolic rift. So I think that if social metabolism is understood in these terms as a singular process, then we can see the flows of flows whose particular moments, whether it's urbanization or imperialism or capital formation, financialization, and so forth, we can see how these moments acquire new properties as they are bundled both materially and symbolically and between human and extra-human natures in the historical development of capitalism, which I mean both over the longue durée and over the past 5 or 50 years, longue durée or short. And in this, I would say that if we can move from the idea of a metabolic rift that capitalism does X, Y, and Z in an axiomatic fashion to a methodological proposition which asks, how do relations of capital and empire and insert your favorite trajectory of modern world history, how do these indicate relations of power and production, the co-production of nature, the accumulation of capital, as bundles of human and extra-human nature? So, the virtue of the metabolic rift perspective can't really be overstated, because in an era where we have this sort of the technocratic dispositions of the Anthropocene argument, and which Tim Luke, amongst others, have really highlighted quite ably, we have a perspective that says, yes, indeed, capitalism is the problem. And what I like to say is it tells us a lot about the what, but not a lot about the how. And if God is in the details, then the how matters quite a bit. So this is why I think that we need a serious post-Cartesian historical geographical method. And I would point out to three spots that we can give our focus to in this capitalism as metabolic rift perspective. One is that we should be cautious about using a generalizing narrative that assembles a general model of capitalism's war on the earth and collects facts to that end. This is essentially a positivist approach. It's very common in systems theory, world systems theory, global capitalism critiques. And secondly, that the metabolic rift perspective unfolds from a Cartesian premise that says natural systems are independent from human systems without any interrogation of their interpenetration. But most of all, and this is what I want to highlight in the second part of this talk, is to move from nature in general to historical natures. And this is a precious clue to understanding how the limits to capitalism are constituted. So what we have in critical environmental studies, global environmental studies, and regional political ecology and regional fields are a bit different because thick description can do what you can't do on a global stage. But what we have here is a highly abstract and weakly historical conception of nature. And I would suggest that we use a turn of phrase that Marx and Engels used, I think, quite well. They talk about historical nature. So at a time when no political economist would talk about production in general as a suitable concept for, say, analyzing the contradictions of neoliberalism or Fordism or pick your era of capitalist development, we still have this notion of nature in general that enjoys a very wide circulation and isn't historically grounded. So we don't have a sense that historical capitalism produces historical natures, and historical natures produce historical capitalism, that these are distinct moments within a self-forming and contradictory whole. So as I've emphasized, and I think that Danny suggested this in his opening remarks, that we have these metabolic approaches. Fisher, Kowalski, and Foster are at least in global environmental change, the two dominant ones. And they emphasize flows and limits, but there's no real sense of a relational core. There's an assertion in the case of Foster and the Monthly Review perspective that this is all about capitalism, but those claims don't have, they're not in a co-productive relation with the rest of nature, which is really a violation of Marx's insights about the relations of humans and the rest of nature. That is to say, how one part of nature is linked to another part. So we need to have a way of putting together the history of capitalism as a totality that is non-deterministic, but is still but in which we still understand that there are real patterns that have played out over the large time and space of the past 5 centuries of capitalism. And so I would say the big question is, does nature merely matter? Does nature matter merely as a consequence, as an output? This is the ecological footprint metaphor, which I find profoundly anti-ecological, if you will. But does nature matter also as a conditioning and constitutive process in the core movements of modernity, and especially those large-scale, long-run vectors of commodification, of urbanization, industrialization, financialization, and so forth? So what I would say is that if we are going to use metabolism as a useful point of entry into understanding the problems and the problems of capitalism as a whole, we need a historical sense of how these pattern transformations of energies, nutrients, humans included, get worked into abstract social nature, which is a very weird way of valuing reality. And I would say this means we need a metabolically informed way to go about charting the transformations and the process through which capitalism turns blood or soil or coal or timber or water or whatever else into capital. And to do this, we need a post-Cartesian reading of value relations in Marx's sense. That, and in my view, this was Marx's reading of value as well, that value is very much constituted on the knife edge of the unpaid work of human and extra-human natures on the one hand and commodified labor on the other hand. So I would say that in a post-Cartesian and dialectical reading of value, that we have abstract social labor as a co-production of humans and the rest of nature. And the value relations don't have metabolism as one of its features, but rather they're produced and are produced through and by metabolisms of work energy channeled through the cash nexus, which becomes the dominant, but not always determining, the dominant way of shaping the rules of production and reproduction in the modern world system. Crucially, I would say we can take up the concerns of metabolic global metabolism approaches, as in the Fisher-Kowalski school and the metabolic rift approach, by understanding that the expanded reproduction of the domain of value, of abstract social labor, turns on a disproportionate expansion in the appropriation of unpaid work. That is, value doesn't work unless most work isn't valued. And what's happened because of the Cartesian dualism is that you have a feminist line of argument on this and an ecosystem services line of argument on this, and they haven't been sufficiently dialectically synthesized. And that's what we need. We need an analysis that sees the unpaid work delivered by, in Maria Mies' stylized phrase, women, nature, and colonies, as central to the global accumulation of capital and the global metabolisms of the capitalist era. So in this, we have abstract social labor as not purely the domain of the exploitation of labor power, as we all learn in Capital and various Marx primers, but that the exploitation of labor power is indeed crucially dependent on cheap natures, especially human labor power, energy, food, and raw materials. And so this means that we need a theory, we need metabolism to understand, to develop a theory of exploitation and appropriation that are simultaneously working together to enable the endless accumulation of this very weird form of wealth, capital, that is abstract social labor. So we'll try to go through this all as I forget to click off and just talk here. So we have a problem of the whole. And this has been vexing both for green Marxism and red Marxism. For environmental studies, there's still the notion of nature in general that has been insufficiently grounded because there's still the notion that modernity or nature, modernity or capitalism or industrial civilization acts upon nature rather than develops through nature. And on the other hand, you have political economists and historical sociologists. The broad theory of social change has been virtually immune to any rethinking along the lines that nature matters. Nature can be regarded, we can have the environmental history of, the political ecology of social processes instead of a view in which the core processes of modernity of class and capital and empire and so on, and race and gender and all of this are themselves constituted through the web of life as bundles of human and extra-human nature. So value gives us a way of understanding the real patterns of the modern world, above all the endless quest for cheap natures, which are found in uncommodified frontiers of labor, food, energy, and raw materials. So it's not generalizing except in that Hegelian sense of a world historical tendency. And value works through the conditions of finding new sources of nature that are not commodified. That's obviously a self-limiting process. So this gets us to a series of concluding remarks around what do we do with this. A lot of what I've said here has been hinted at and argued more or less explicitly and implicitly by green and red-green theorists, philosophers, geographers for many years now. But the emphasis overwhelmingly has been on deconstruction rather than reconstruction in terms of actually doing research. We have a philosophical position that says, okay, we have the production of nature, human beings are a part of nature, humans are produced, co-produced by the rest of nature, but it hasn't yet gained real traction in the historical social sciences and in the history of the modern world especially. So this is what the World-Ecology Synthesis tries to do, that tries to move the philosophical premise of humanity, of capitalism, in nature from a philosophical premise into the history of capitalism's long run and short run, large and small scale, and tries to move beyond this Cartesian sorting out of the world. When we say world ecology, we don't mean the ecology of the world, but rather the bounded and patterned configurations of human and extra-human natures over long time and large space. So the modern world system is the one that we're living in, at least for now. And part of the reconstructive project is to offer and propose and start the ball rolling on a conceptual vocabulary that can unify these two supposedly different, but as we know, singular processes of human and extra-human natures. So we talk about the oikos as the relation that forms and reforms these acting units, whether they're town and country, core and periphery, bourgeois and proletarian, so on and so forth, that we have a way of talking about the relation rather than simply the interactions of the acting units. And here this allows us to focus on the relation of species and environments, that all species make environments and all environments make life. Well, simple enough, but much more challenging to work into our analytical frames and methodological premises. So, to repeat, what we're looking at is the accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, and the co-production of nature in the history as constituting value in the history and the key moments of the history of capitalism. Again, not as independent concept boxes in the tradition of systems ecology, all the way back to the limits to growth, and today with the Anthropocene and Earth system arguments that we've seen so much of, but as dialectical moments constituting a rich totality of many determinations. So all of which takes us to the question of limits. And the limit of capital is, well, you know, the green Marxists today have really gone back to an old externalist argument that the limit of capital is nature conceived of everything outside of humans. Red Marxism continues to emphasize internal contradictions, although sometimes, as you see in David Harvey's recent book, to, I think, unfortunately reintroduce the concept of scarcities without adequately grounding those in the kinds of dialectical arguments he pioneered in previous decades. The world ecology approach would see value in the terms that I've outlined it, premised on the exploitation of labor power and the appropriation of cheap, unpaid work, of cheap natures, as the crucial relational thread unifying these two moments and providing a way to get beyond a mechanical interaction approach that is so common today. So, if metabolism in a global perspective is going to be useful, it has to address these questions of limits. I would say that there are no social limits, there are no natural limits, at least in the ways that those are frequently and conventionally used. That we need to have a vocabulary that transcends that language, because social limits are at every turn bound up with biophysical transformations and also ideas of what constitutes the boundary between the so-called social and the natural. And so we need what I would call ecological limits, or some kind of limits that bring together the human and the extra-human, the material and the symbolic, as messy bundles of power, of production, of ideas. And so we would say first that all limits are historical. That is, we need to look at the specific configurations of human and extra-human natures and the dominant relations that knit them together. In the modern world system, that would be capital and labor. In feudalism, that would be lord and peasant. We could multiply that list at some length. Secondly, that nature is not external, and that its energies are not drawn down, as in the fossil capitalism argument, the thermodynamics argument, through geological exhaustion, although drawing down does occur. We need to understand that the movement from geology to geohistory is one in which humans figure prominently, and there is a relational thread to that. And finally, that all nature is historical nature. So there is a nature in general, and that is only a starting point. And I think what's happened, especially amongst Marxist and critical approaches on global environmental change, is that we have nature in general without a sense of the production of historical natures. And that leads to a series of positivist and structural functionalist moves that I think are not only intellectually but also politically unproductive. So, the limit of capital is, well, I would say co-produced through the oikos, a civilizational relation that is a historical one, that is premised on frontier movements of appropriating cheap natures in the service of a series of technical innovations that maximize labor productivity and commodity production and exchange. And by the way, this doesn't begin in 1800 or 1750, but in the long 16th century, and indeed in the era 1450 to 1550, we see a remarkable series of mechanizations and also scientific cartographic approaches to dealing with the world that radically increased labor productivity, as in the conventional classic Marxist scheme. So that relation is now exhausting itself. That relation of exploitation and appropriation is now exhausting itself. And it's exhausting itself because it is co-produced. It's not exhausting an external substance that then runs out of gas, although that's how it's presented, but that this relation of appropriation and exploitation through which we have an expanded reproduction of capital is in just meeting declining capacities to secure and deliver cheap nature is more, it's faltering in its need to secure more and more unpaid work to capital accumulation. And this is manifest not only in the what's now called the long super cycle, the unprecedented commodity boom of the past 10, now going on 11 years in metals, food, and oil, but also in dramatically rising unit labor costs in the workshop of the world, that is China, over the past decade. So there again, we have a crisis of nature that transcends the crisis of cheap nature, that transcends the Cartesian divide, because we have the exhaustion of the relation that has provided recurrently over the long history of capitalism cheap natures, that is cheap labor power, cheap metals, cheap energy, and cheap food. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. I just want to clarify that we will have time for Q&A at the end of each panel and discussion. So we continue with our next speaker, which is Earl Ellis. Earl is a Baltimore County and visiting associate professor of geography and environmental systems and director of the Laboratory for Anthropogenic Landscape Ecology at the University of Maryland. He was also here with us last semester, and he's going to be again next year, I think, teaching in the Landscape Architecture department. He's one of the major figures contributing extensive analytical research within the Anthropocene paradigm. Please join me in welcoming Earl Ellis. You know your way around? Go back and forth.
All right, so this one's forward. Well, thank you, Nikos and Danny, for giving me a chance to join this very diverse group of thinkers. I'm normally talking to ecologists. I'm an ecologist. And my recent work is focused on the global ecology of anthropogenic landscapes. And that's more or less what I'm going to be talking about. Although the fascinating thing for me is already I feel this amazing kind of deep connection to some of this stuff that I've never really heard much about before. Oh, it's the other way. Got it. So I'm going to talk about the global ecology of what I call the anthropogenic biosphere. So this is the ecologies that humans have created. And I'll talk about some of the global patterns of these. And ultimately, the most important question is, what does this mean, these ecologies we've created, for our opportunities to have a better Anthropocene, a future in which essentially we can look forward to things instead of just engage in a crisis discussion. The classical view of ecology when it's describing the global patterns of life on Earth is very simple and involves simply the long-term evolution of patterns of biology related to climate. And of course, climate right now is changing more rapidly than at any time in human history. So, of course, this pattern is not something you can think of as static anymore, although it has this static view of a global ecology, kind of a simple pattern that everyone's familiar with. You learn this really in kindergarten. You start with learning about the tropical rainforests and the grasslands. But even though when I say the word biosphere, the word that pops to mind, the vision, usually, even to me at this point, it often is this idea of these kind of wild rainforests out there somewhere as being what global ecology is all powered by. We live in a different time than that, where you could look out in the world and see all these large areas of wildlands. We live in the Anthropocene, geological time period in which humans are one of the primary driving forces in the Earth system. One reason I like this slide, besides the fact that it's shown over and over and over again, you've all seen it a million times, is that it illustrates a very interesting property of how humans are creating this new geological epoch. The idea that this is simply lots of people, right, the influence of a very important organism, fails to explain really the processes that have enabled us to transform the entire planet, to shift the course of Earth's history into a new and unprecedented path is this emergent property of all of us interacting together. None of us can turn this off. Some people are trying to change the energy supply that makes the Earth glow at night, which is, of course, also unprecedented. But it's really a scale above even society, if there is such a thing as society, that produces this. It's a high-level emergent process. And in a sense, the real prospects for the good Anthropocene, in theory, might come from being able to engage in these kinds of global emergent processes coming from human systems to move them in some better direction. Because at this point, I think we pretty much just watch these things occur and maybe grumble about them. In terms of global ecology, and in my world with ecologists, I've made a big effort to understand what are the global patterns of ecology that we now have thanks to long-term human interactions with the biosphere. And to do this, we used global data sets, and there's a lot of work on this, but simply put, we combined data for global populations and land use practices and land cover and looked at what are the most important, most globally significant patterns on Earth. And from this, we come up with another view of the biosphere, an anthropogenic biosphere in the Anthropocene that's shaped by long-term human interactions. And you can look at these as having a variety of patterns. Wildlands defined very simply here as places without human population or use of land. Of course, these places are also affected by climate. This is what wildlands mostly look like today. They're areas that are too dry or too cold or both and not very interesting to people, so there's not a whole lot of people there. That's what wildness really looks like for the most part globally. We have a lot more of this kind of thing, semi-natural lands. These are areas that are either recovering or remnants of areas that have small amounts of land use. This is a much broader area. We have rangelands. This is one of the most extensive categories of land use, ranging from very light use of land with, for example, one time a year there might be some animals grazing temporarily, to these very densely populated and ancient rangelands like this one in Morocco, which is the center of origin for alfalfa. Croplands. When we think of crops, there's a tendency to just think of a place out there with just crops, but in fact, crops tend to be embedded in croplands that are mosaics of used and other forms of ecologies, all integrated together, settlements, small patches of woodlands, etc. That's the most common form of croplands in the world. Villages. If you're not from Asia or parts of Europe, you're probably not so familiar with them because they're actually maybe a little bit here in New England, we might see these. These are very densely populated, very old, subsistence usually, starting off with agricultural landscapes. So their difference from, say, a regular cropland is that they're so densely populated that huge numbers of people live in them. If you look, you'll see it's a very large percentage of Earth's population still lives in these kind of village landscapes. And then we arrive at the central focus of a lot of the activity here at GSD, in my experience, is the urban, and properly addressed as a very dense set of settlements that dominate the landscape, at least in that simple definition. It's a very small percentage of Earth's landscapes fall into this category. You can see about 1.5 million square kilometers. That's approximately 1% of Earth's land surface. Compared to the other categories, a tiny fraction. And we often tend to think of it, of course, very densely populated. We tend to think of urban areas as being like this, and these do occur and are very interesting and powerful, but this is the most common form of urban settlement in the world, some kind of no-name, mid-sized to small city in a developing country that you've never heard of. That's the most common form of urban today. And of course, I must show something from Baltimore. Beautiful Baltimore land mosaics with row houses, maybe some drug deals going on there. Okay, here we have a very simple view of the global patterns of ecology with people in it. People live, for the most part, in relatively densely populated anthropogenic biomes, or anthromes, mostly in the urban and village anthromes. So we're pretty concentrated. In terms of the global effect of humans, though, 3/4 of Earth's land can be considered to be transformed by some level of human activity and population, about 3/4, and only 1/4 left without that as wildlands. In terms of area of wild forests, again, this kind of poster child for biology on Earth, the biosphere, the wild forest, is actually less extensive today than the extent of these densely populated anthromes, the villages and urban areas. So if we're interested in global ecology, the idea that wild forests represent it is not true, at least from the point of view of area. In terms of net primary production, which is one of the most fundamental indicators of biological activity, it's essentially the energy harvested by plants that drives all of Earth's ecology. About 90% of it is occurring within landscapes that are anthropogenic, that have some influence of humans. And the wild forest net primary production is actually less than the net primary production occurring within these densely populated anthromes. One of the main reasons for that is, as you saw, the areas that are left wild are areas that are not the most productive areas. They're the least productive areas tend to be left wild, and that's why they have an even less significant effect on the world's net primary production. And a full quarter of Earth's tree cover, notice I'm not saying forests, Earth's tree cover is embedded within croplands. Only about 19% is in wildlands. So the domestic species of trees are often getting more common here. If we look at the very simple pattern that we see, the most simple form, about 40% of Earth's land is directly in use for crops, pastures, and settlements, about 40%. About a quarter is without the direct human influence. We also have this other category kind of in between, and that's an interesting fact. If you look at how big that category is, it's bigger than the category of wildlands, the novel ecosystems. And these are ecologies embedded within used landscapes, transformed in some way by human activity. There's lots of different forms of these, but they are global. And the reason for this is that humans rarely use landscapes completely. Or if they do, they use the landscapes in many different ways, leaving embedded within these used landscapes portions of either remnant, recovering, or lightly used ecosystems that resemble those that came before, but are transformed by the properties of human settlement and land use that cause things like species invasions and all sorts of changes in soils, et cetera. So they're not the same as these kinds of natural ecologies. So again, this simple view of the world, novel ecosystems being predominant as the remaining kind of natural, quote, natural ecologies, semi-natural ecologies. When we think of novel ecosystems, it's a little bit like the way we think of a woodland. So woodlands are a classic thing that we can all conceive of. A woodland is not a woodland just because of its natural ecology. It has a human context, and that human context may define more of the ecology, the ecological processes, the biodiversity, et cetera, than any kind of pre-existing natural condition. The dominant form of nature can now be found as a social construct in many areas of the world. Sometimes it's a used ecosystem, but a lot of times it's just one of these embedded forms of ecologies. And here's an example from China that I find kind of classic as an example of, this is a woodland that's managed by many, many households in little patches, and it still appears as a woodland, and it serves as habitat for species, et cetera, has ecological functions like carbon sequestration, yet it is something that could never exist without constant human interaction. If we think about the ecologies that we create, rather than just thinking in terms of the classic view of just climate and maybe soil shaping these ecologies, we have to think about the human construction of these systems, both intentional and unintentional. In fact, the unintentional in general being at least as great. And there's many different processes that we change in this way, and biodiversity being one of the classic ones, shifting communities to new states, often with very rich populations of exotic species. This is nothing new. And it was interesting that pushing back to the 1400s is definitely considered pushing back into deep history. But when we think about geologic time and we think about ecology and we look at the long-term human presence on the land, we can actually see the trajectory of humans in transforming the planet is quite ancient. And this is some work we did looking at global models of land transformation, starting with the very origins of agriculture. And one of the simple things you see here is that there's some areas of the world where you have very, very ancient, significant transformation of landscapes. Even before that, we can push back even before that. Some of the greatest changes that may have occurred in the biology of the planet is owing to the human-induced loss of some of these very powerful, dominant carnivores and herbivores that shaped the ecosystems before humans hunted them to extinction or drove their habitats into extinction. But the fundamental premise that I think is the most interesting one, it's the one that creates those very ancient patterns of landscape transformation, is that when there's plenty of land around, when there's no shortage of land, this is the way you should farm. This is the easy way. You should use as little labor as possible to gain your sustenance. I think that's pretty much the rule for everybody. And in the old days when there was no shortage of land at the origins of agriculture, this was the easy way. Just burn something down and let stuff grow back. In fact, even before agriculture, this was a practice to attract game and encourage the growth of species that were very productive for hunter-gatherers. They cleared land. Open woodlands and this sort of thing, open grasslands, were created by the first users of land, the hunter-gatherers, and then later led, as land became more scarce, toward more intensive propagation systems and ultimately toward the origins of agriculture. Again, though, using land relatively extensively per person, using a lot of land per person. But then land eventually becomes scarce as people become more densely populated, and you end up having to work a great deal harder. And by say the 1600s in China, you're starting to see everybody in at least the densely populated rice-growing regions having to farm like this. And if you've ever done it, it's really one of the hardest things you can imagine doing all day. So we have this process that drives the global ecological transformation of the planet by humans, which is the intensification of land use. At the very early stages, as I noted, when there's no shortage of land, people are using a lot of land per person. But as populations become more dense, there's an incentive to use land more productively. You pretty much have to gain your sustenance from the same old land. So as populations grow and as demand for the produce of land increases, you get these more and more intensive and productive agricultural systems until eventually you get to those kind of systems that you saw just before, and ultimately leading to something that is, again, something relatively new on the planet, which is the use of industrial synthesis to drive ecology. In this case, this is synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, and it would actually be more or less impossible to sustain the Chinese population on Chinese land's production without synthetic nitrogen. So this has become an existential product. We more or less need synthetic nitrogen to produce more food on the same land as we do today. And it also saves, as you can imagine, a lot of labor. Imagine carrying the same amount of nitrogen in the form of manure, if you even had it. A lot more labor. So it's a labor-saving device. We get forced into this continuous cycle of increasing intensification. Essentially, when you are able to adopt a technology that gets more out of the same land, such as, say, tillage or the propagation of a favored species, these kinds of performance-enhancing technologies, you have a kind of a good period, an intensification period. But of course, eventually, as populations live up to that or demand lives up to that, you kind of hit this stage where you have to put in so much more labor for every increment of output that you get this involution, this kind of bad period where you have to work harder to get the same thing. And then eventually, you might confront a crisis where there really isn't enough to go around anymore and are forced to either adopt a new system of production or you're going to have some kind of decline. Again, it's very hard for these things to go in different directions. They tend to just go in one direction. So I think all of you can guess what this poster is, even without reading the Chinese. This is called the Rich Farmer, Poor Farmer poster. It was the first successful advertisement for chemical fertilizer in China. And the big question that, again, you would want to ask about any commercial or advertisement is this false advertising? Is this just selling us a bill of goods? Do we need this fertilizer? And the answer is yes. You get about a 4 times increase for the same amount of land with a relatively small investment with the chemical fertilizer. You're not going to find a whole lot of Chinese folks going the other direction. It's generally, once these technologies are available, we tend to adopt them and we don't go back. This has also made possible some of the most unprecedented migrations in history. And the biggest one going on today is the migration of rural people in developing countries into the city. We've already done this for the most part in the developed world, but in rural areas of China, you can almost hear the sucking sound. People are just all going to the city in droves. It's really a remarkable thing. When I show this slide to my ecologist colleagues, I inevitably kind of, you can hear the feeling in the room. It's kind of like, oh, it's an ecological disaster, right? This kind of uncontrolled, unplanned urban growth is just nothing less than a disaster. But what I would put forward is this form, not necessarily exactly like this, but this concept of increasing concentration of people into cities is actually one of the greatest opportunities we've ever had to transform our relationship with the biological world. And you can see this already in a lot of the developed world, where you've seen the recovery of large areas of woodlands as a result of the increasing intensity of agriculture that is demanded by very dense populations in cities. When people are producing for themselves, they're often producing just enough, but that's not going to be enough to form the food supply for cities. So the demands of cities tend to scale up and drive increasing intensities of agriculture, leading to forms of production that do not value marginal land. Marginal land becomes essentially worthless to intensive industrial producers, and they just let it go. This does not happen just because of technology. It requires policies that support this form of land change. So it's possible, for example, you could have recover in one place and then everyone's farming extensively somewhere else if there's no policy to guide that. But Brazil, for example, is now implementing policies to guide more intensive use of land. And you see this all over the world. This is just an example from the United States. The recovery of woodlands is a very common thing. This is a planetary opportunity, especially as now we're reaching peak child, as Hans Rosling has said. Our birth rates are now leveled off. They probably will never be higher. And the residual population growth we're expecting over the next 20 years is basically because of declining death rates. Pretty much that's the demographic. So we're going to see a leveling off of human populations very soon. We have new opportunities to do things differently. The interesting thing is, even though we're talking here about planetary opportunities, things we can do to change our global relationships, we're still actually looking at most of those planetary opportunities being at kind of the lower scales, local, and this sort of thing. We need to think about what we're going to do with these landscapes. And as you all know, the construction of landscapes in all forms, social, ecological, the built infrastructure, is very much a local process. You can't just do it at a global scale. Yet, the opportunity that we see here is, in a sense, a global opportunity to do something different at local scales. So it presents a very interesting, I think, challenge. We're not necessarily very good at bringing these different functions together. The ecologies that we create when we try to bring, for example, the wildlife into the city or the production system can create as much confrontation as production. Again, we're not so good at this. It's not to say that this view that we have this opportunity means that we will necessarily produce something better. We can also get this. Nevertheless, the opportunity that we now have, thanks to the amazing interconnection of the societies that now exist, we do, in many ways, we're actually gaining a truly global form of social system. This is an unprecedented opportunity, as well as something that, of course, changes so fast that it can change the world anywhere, with influence from one place leading to an influence in the other through teleconnections that are so quick and powerful that they're very hard to predict or to deal with. Nevertheless, the opportunity is there. Nope. China's not there. Oops. People on the ground, and I really don't have to tell you this, but it's something that ecologists often struggle with. People on the ground are really the solution. They understand their local conditions. They are the people who know how to live with landscapes that are multifunctional. And they're usually pretty eager to do this when they're confronted with this in a way that enables them to gain something for themselves. We have new forms of science and new forms of interaction enabled by some of these new interconnecting technologies, and I think they do open up new opportunities. Of course, a shameless plug for one of my projects, the ability now for individuals to do their own mapping of landscapes in 3 dimensions. This is something that we now have. It's not something that just has to be done by experts somewhere far away, but you can do them yourself. We are getting smarter and getting better at bringing these multiple functions together. So we have opportunities to bring back, for example, species that have had a hard time with people for many obvious reasons, right? Nobody really wants to live with wolves in their backyard. Yet, in some of the most densely populated regions of the world, we do have a recovery of a dangerous megafauna species. So the really new things are happening. Nature is coming back in many ways. And you don't really have to worry about nature kind of disappearing or shrinking away. Nature is very powerful, and it's perfectly glad to live in our substrates that we create all over the world. And just a little reflection on some of my experience here at GSD. I was teaching in the fall and trying to comprehend the meaning of design. Something, a great challenge for me, because as a scientist, I'm mostly in this top level there, the observing phase. I just want to understand what's going on. But this idea of engaging with landscapes and ecologies in some form of direct way to create these, to push them in some direction. I've been thinking about what are the opportunities for doing this. And all these four ways of engaging landscapes and ecologies could be done separately, but they can also be done together. They have some conflict, but also have some synergy. But those are ideas that I've been thinking about for engaging the ecologies of the Anthropocene in a more proactive way, now that we have some of these planetary opportunities to do things differently. So just like this is a land use, right? It looks like nature, but there's another one of these very nearby that is underneath water and serves as a reservoir. The creation of these spaces is very much an act of stewardship. The acts of engineering to create the spaces that we need, the infrastructures that we need. The acts of creating whole new forms of natures that serve us in ways that make it possible to, in a sense, have our cake and eat it too. We can all have a backyard in Manhattan. Very interesting prospects of new ideas like this. And the idea that maybe some of the most interesting possibilities arrive in the form of allowing processes to emerge. The concept of rewilding landscapes, just letting things go, can also be an act that we can engage in the Anthropocene. So with that, I'll conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Earl, and also thanks to keep the time. It's amazing precision of the first two speakers. We hope we can be on time the entire day. Our next speaker is Timothy Luke. Timothy is a University Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Science at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University in Blacksburg, Virginia. Tim is a prominent figure that has helped to unpack how recent popular debates on climate change are dominated by neoliberal ideologies. Please welcome me please join me in welcoming Timothy Luke.
Well, first of all, thank you, Pablo, Nikos, Daniel, Graduate School of Design, for inviting me here to talk today. And I think some of my comments can play off of interesting insights that have come to us from Jason and from Earl so far, in the sense that I believe what I'm doing in my paper and my comments. When Jason says, what do we get with nature plus society, I want to suggest that it's basically cyborganicity. And that when we're either looking at rift metabolism or shift metabolism, I think fora like this and the way that the disciplines that organize fora like this are to a certain extent involved in what I would maybe consider a metabolic rift or shift management process. I think that as I have looked at what I've called environmentality, or what other people call green governmentality, there's quite clearly a power knowledge block, a power knowledge network emerging in what I call planetarianism or planetary management. And these great graphics that Earl presented us, I think, give us one sense of how those kinds of images, those kinds of inventories, those kinds of, if you will, linear programs or input-output tables are being constructed, and with them a kind of interest in a co-production of nature that presumes a kind of a cyborganic approach to society and to nature. And here, let me use, these kinds of binary oppositions of the natural to social, nature, culture, and whatnot, just as kind of rhetorical devices, and I clearly do not see them as discrete as they're suggested. And in this, what I guess I've been trying to do, and I think why I've been asked to talk is I'm trying to come up with a vocabulary or a conceptual array to help us get thinking about these generalized assemblies in a less particular way, and to see the sort of dispersed stock, stuff, services of nature as a general system rather than in the discrete structures of cities, and think about how in many ways the ecologies that we're thinking about, as Earl just showed us, where one can engage in their own geophysical, biophysical mapping, launch your own swarm of mini drones to see what's happening with out in the fields, out in the woods, the GPS collared wolves that one can watch on the internet, all of this sort of thing. Increasingly, nature itself is becoming embedded with brilliance, or made a smarter planet, as IBM would like to say. And I think that's somewhat interesting. So just permit me a few moments of reading, and I guess I'll kind of get through this quickly so we can get to the discussion. To articulate a provisional understanding of urban metabolism, I think we need to think through alternatives that are tied to cyborganic ecologies beneath, behind, and beside urbanization, which is often seen as proceeding along a different scale than our organic ecologies out elsewhere where there isn't urbanization. Can they better disclose, these cyborganic ecologies, key aspects of urban metabolic upscaling that's not yet well understood? By using the idea of arcology, again, taking this from Paolo Soleri's notion in the 50s and 60s, where he wanted to see how one can fuse architecture and implicitly urban design with ecology in what in his minds were perhaps going to be massive megastructures that would reduce the footprint of urbanization on the planet. I think that's an interesting idea, to sort of think unconventionally, to view cybernetic organisms and machinic formations that are really sustaining us. When Earl asked, well, what do you think about when you're in the biosphere in kindergarten and you look at the rainforest? I sort of think of Exxon, Comcast, Walmart, Verizon, Bank of America. That's really our biosphere now. They suck stuff out of the rainforest, but where we live is amidst or with a lot of what I would call synbiota, the corporate world. I mean, no less than the U.S. Supreme Court has said corporations are people, so they're with us, and they're surviving in a kind of coexistence that's, I think, quite curious. So, with today's increasingly popular notion of the Anthropocene, it provides one foreground for detailing some of the aesthetic, formal, material, symbolic imprints left by modern materiality as spatial processes and structures that are associated with citified metabolic exchanges across wide arrays of sites with a divergent scale, speed, and scope. And here I want to use citification different than urbanization, in the sense of a lot of times we connect, or at least I connect, urbanization with the construction of global cities, capital G, capital C, the Weltstadt, New York, Frankfurt, Beijing, places like that. Citification, I think, is this more pervasive, global, small u urbanization, small g, small c, global cities. Okay, that is really what is creating this process, and that this citification of the planet, which has these urbiformative effects, has become, as Earl suggested, normative. There's an urban normativity in urbiformativity, and that even if you live out in the wilds, in the alfalfa field of Morocco, or you're trying to, track down the caribou in Alaska or whatnot, there's been a kind of urbanization of consciousness, or urbanization of life. You're still plugged in to the internet, you're getting satellite TV, essentially you live in a food desert until you go to some big box store where you can get all of this palletized edibles. And all of it is really, in many ways, what we are surviving on is what I call petrovory, that we, essentially eat oil. Fossil fuel is what sustains us, whether it's the nitrogen going into the rice fields or the high test going into our trucks, that the omnivory that we exist in now is essentially a form of petrovory. So as we look at this, we have, I think looking at these kinds of ecologies or these kinds of economies are really what's is crucial, because for all intents and purposes, the Anthropocene is really, in the citified sense, an Anthropocene. Okay, that the time in which we are living is we have to look at these transport, sanitation, manufacturing, habitation, energy, consumption, agronomic systems. They're all engineered together, which is creating, in their quantitative expansion, a worrisome qualitative biospheric degradation. Not that it can't be reduced, and in fact, I think moments like this are an attempt to create interventions and corrective systems which will apply material flow analysis, life cycle assessment, biomimic design, eco-services, accounting, all of these kinds of varied disciplines of industrial ecology, as well as new forms of urban or planetary design to try and correct this to create a more salutary or survivable or satisfying environment. So I think then what we ought to be looking at are these sort of metro-metabolic transformations. They release energy, recode information, reassemble matter, reorder activity on multiple scales for humans and non-humans alike. To the degree that mapping such human-machinic assemblages can be done, can one track how they emerge from the dynamic creation and accretion of immaterial and material metabolites as these citifying masses of material, of these communities of consumption or these regions of interaction? My questions are meant to be evocative, to mobilize eco-critique as a tool to unpack this planetary upscaling of metro-metabolic processes as they are at play now in global citification. Biosphere II, for example, it's an odd experiment in Pima County, Arizona, once meant for terraforming other planets. Say Mars, for example, to begin something like Earth. But it ignores the scales of complexity that have already made our world, Biosphere I, something beyond Biosphere II, by diverting each visitor's attention away from the megacities and super sprawls that occasionally send tourists to Tucson on short eco-tours to behold such stylized ecologies under glass, such as you would see at Biosphere II. Human individuals and collectives, along with their companion species of domesticated animals and plants, and undomesticated but equally co-evolutionary microbiota, are multiple modes of urban techniques, complex agricultures, and dense trade networks transforming terra. We are terraforming the planet, and to a certain extent, this is a historicization of nature. How are we going to historicize nature? How are we going to terraform nature? So developing and sustaining the metro-metabolisms of these human, animal, plant, and microbiota ecologies to sustain what we all seem to want to keep, which is more or less modernity, is what develops at the core of herbiformative processes. But these metromorphoses cannot begin without the acts and artifacts that fuse ecologies and economies at different scales, speeds, and sizes into cyborganicity. They're not yet fully legible agrarian, informational, or industrial ecologies, but they do pose major problems for the analysis in a political economy. Turning to more comprehensive critical analyses of their logistical grids, links, and nets, using the insights of cyborg-driven assessment might initiate some key inflection. And obviously, I don't think the cyborg metaphor is completely useful, but it's the best one that I think I've found. And today I was talking at breakfast with Matt, and we both have been, sitting on things for a long time saying, wow, this is a pretty good idea, but we're not sure we've entirely gotten it to where we want to go. But I think it has potential. So provisional notions like cyborganicity, as they have been previously deployed, track some of these socio-spatial transformations around the world. Whether or not you want to accept cyborganicity as a key constitutive piece of the Anthropocene, many argue that the unusual curiosities now must be confronted. New scales of urbanization, fuzzy rearticulations of urbanized territories, the degradation of disintegrated hinterlands, and an end to wilderness. Brenner and Schmidt have asserted, for example, and I think this is quite true, quote, we need, first of all, some new theoretical categories through which to investigate the relentless production and transformation of the social spatial organization across scales and territories. To this end, a new conceptual lexicon must be created for identifying a wide variety of urbanization processes that are currently shaping the urban world, and relatedly, for deciphering the new emergent landscapes of socio-spatial difference that are been crystallizing in recent decades. To a degree, I think these analytical and conceptual needs might be met by the hybridized first, second, and third notions like cyborganicity. So using, Donna Haraway first put this forward in 1985 in an article in an obscure journal at the time called Socialist Revolution that became, I think, Socialist Register, that ended up as Radical Sociology and then sort of went to a demise around 2006 or 8 or so. But it got dressed up and, embedded in an anthology and lives on in, popular discourse. And I think it helps us think about urban metabolisms. But in doing so, I think we need to sort of get to a place where if cyborgs once were unnoticed modes of agency in the metabolisms of modernity as discretely individualized subjects forming along the brittle borders of man-machine interfaces, then what are the much more collectivized subjectivities flowing in the fusion of machine-human, animal-human, non-physical, physical forces all interacting together in this cyborganic or cyborganization of the planet and its systems? Without being non-biocentric, where do these families, born by machinic, human, and non-physical lineages, gather in the metabolisms of modernity? If cyborgs are human-machine fusions, then certain cyborgs, for example, say in Germany, do they compose a collective of gasoline-burning, Audi-driving, smartphone-using, vaccine-getting human machines? How do they differ considerably from, say, wood-burning, burro-riding, telephone-lacking, vaccination cyborgs in Guatemala? Both communities coexist in the same globalized grid of herbiformative metrometabolism, but one niche tends to be inhabiting high-end designer condos, while the other may rest in a patchwork barrio of tin sheets and scrap lumber. One may get to tidy up its room with little domestic robots, but another may sit under the watch of surveillance drones. When taken together, these particular agents, which are simultaneously quasi-objects, now fabricate their own complex synthetic environments as maybe quasi-biota in these huge global systems. So if human machines can rightly be regarded as these machinic ensembles where power, space, production, energy, matter, organization, and information come together in what are now our sustainable life world, then how might we look at this? To me, I think Max Weber actually sensed some of the stirrings of this in the Protestant Ethic, where he argued that once the fusion of symbolic, what I call iconomies, and material economies ignited the interfaces of urban industrial exchange, he said, quote, it did its part in building a tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order, which I think we've been seeing mapped today. This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all individuals who are born into this mechanism, not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition, with irresistible force. Perhaps it will so determine them until the last ton of fossilized coal is burnt. And I think to a certain extent that's what many of us are worried about in terms of planetary organization. Yet does Weber entreat us to entertain a fully machinic construction of the Earth, maybe as Gaia? And is Gaia's life now metamorphing yet again through nano, bio, info, cogno, or NBIC techniques into still fluid forms and functions? The planet may in fact be alive on many scales. Not only are the Earth and its living organic systems alive as a planetary life form, but are its diverse co-evolving machinic system alive as quota biota within human economies and societies. Global commodity chains, pipeline webs, electrical grids, gas lines, fiber networks, wireless footprints, transport lanes, which are not yet fully mapped or made, are spatialities of these artificial corporate entities or persons, a human machinic life form that helps us all survive. For example, there's a casinopolitan urbanism in Macau and Vegas, which is sustainably developed maybe by the same toxic energies which are entombed in the thanopolitan urbanism of Chernobyl's Pripyat or Fukushima's Daiichi's Okuma. Systemic forces of meaning, power, and money are reframing locality and globality and redirecting, I hope, the way that we organize our power knowledge regimes to map this metromorphic process. Ironically, today's performative practices guarantee that Chernobyl is everywhere, but whatever happens at the Venetian tends to stay in Vegas or Macau. Speed, structure, and size once kept certain sites far more detached and distinct, the core and periphery, heartland and hinterland, metropolis and wilderness. But this evolving fusion of human machines, organisms and mechanisms, informatics and biospherics in omnivorous supply chains of third nature are imploding under this acidifying trend as what we understand as our environment. The gas pump hose nozzle put into every Audi in Berlin to a certain extent extends around the world. A machinic formation behind oil refineries, fracked fields, crude trains, modular factories, utopian ads, state legalities, corporate offices, personal tastes, all are creating a petrovorous economy. Yet, excellent. Okay, so in that, the man-machine interfaces are coming together at the conjunctures of craft, culture, commerce in this cyborganicity. Take an example. Paolo Soleri's Cosanti is not the urban-normative root of Phoenix's urbiformativity. Instead, the Valley of the Sun is an economy of excess, which has actually kept Soleri's utopian ecology imprisoned in a tiny little time warp since 1972, where it still struggles to become an actually existing ecologism in the high country of Yavapai County outside of Cordes Junction, miles away. It is not yet mummified as Arizona's Casa Grande 2, but its once hippie liberatory urbanity is now nearly lost as the Southwest long gone Anasazi peoples. Cyborganicity, then, is forming in very interesting ways, which are beyond those of one-time grand urban designers. Crude oil lifted out of West Texas soon becomes plastic particulates swirling in the Pacific Ocean's great plastic gyres. Fossil-fueled work accumulates in grandiose bronze, concrete, and marble edifices for the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., while innumerable detrital flows of solid, liquid, and gaseous waste from the cities, towns, and farms burned from 1939 to 1945 still to an extent linger aloft in carbon dioxide molecules dispersed all around the planet's atmosphere. Material markers, maybe, of a degraded biosphere being wrenched into the Anthropocene. What lies behind us in the distant past is less significant than what is being produced and consumed today, because the scale and scope of the severe change in the planet's ecologies are indeed unprecedented. CO2 from the Gilded Age remains high overhead, still melting Greenland, and killing the corals around Guadalcanal. Design, I would hope, wants to give form, take command, lend shape to all of these influences, but it does so without thinking as much or as consciously about these metrometabolisms in herbiformativity. Cidification then needs to, I think, be rethought in terms of the material kinematics of a logistics past, a logistics present, and a logistics yet to come. I don't know how many of you read the Wall Street Journal, but they've recently been running a great ad, which looks down Michigan Avenue at twilight from above with its skyscrapers and suburbs all lit to the horizon, which celebrates what some people might think is ours, Chicago's, or the Earth's existence. But Exxon wants to tell us something different. Energy lives here. Not people, not Chicago, but energy. And Exxon wants to be reminding us that sentient beings and brilliant things that have the real challenge of supplying the energy needed for progress while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what 80,000 Exxon employees want to do to make certain that its planetary urbanization can continue the way that it has been. So, when thinking about the Earth as a social ecological system, obviously what we're trying to think about here today and throughout this conference is without fully understanding it, it cannot maybe be managed. It cannot really be managed if there is not some intervention of greater design into it. So bringing new concepts, new conceptualizations, new frameworks into thinking about this moment in history, which might mark the advent of the Anthropocene, it might mark the emergence of planetary management, is quite clearly the case that new terrains are very uncertain, but they are also less unfamiliar. They are our anthropoceneries. These anthropoceneries in the Anthropocene are corporate-owned seed and genetically engineered fish, plastic-laden oceans and soil-burdened rivers, disappearing animal beings and yet evolving machine intelligence, rising seas and retreating ice fields, drought-stricken regions but inundated coastal zones, the last gasp of going extinct charismatic megafauna coming with rapid blooms of post-antibiotic microbial organisms, continental urban sprawls and minuscule remote wildernesses, a light-polluted night and an exhaust-polluted day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And just to mention, for those of you who are intrigued by Tim's neologisms and didn't manage to grasp them all, we actually convinced him to compile a small glossary that is going to accompany his contribution to the upcoming issue of New Geography. So looking forward to it. Our last speaker for the day, and thank you for staying with us because this was a longer panel than usual, is Matthew Gandhi. Matthew is Professor of Geography at the University College of London and was the director of the UCL Urban Laboratory from 2006 to 2011. Matthew is one of the prominent figures and intellectual founders of urban political ecology. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Gandhi.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I've used this title to think about questions of different kinds of circulations and metabolisms, and I want to divide up this brief talk into firstly thinking through some of the periodicities that are associated with these relationships, and linking that to questions of historical periodization. And then secondly, I want to say some words about metabolisms and think through some of the connectivities and socio-spatial constellations related to what we're talking about. So to begin with then, this question of periodicities. If we look at attempts to make sense of changes over time, and I should say that most of my examples today will be drawn from questions of water and water infrastructure, and I've just completed a book called The Fabric of Space, which looks through some of the questions I'm going to talk about. If we look at the question of water infrastructure, classic explorations such as Siegfried Gideon's Mechanization Takes Command from 1948 discusses the possibility that the history of bathing, for example, yields searching insights into what he terms the inner nature of the period. But what is this inner nature that we might be able to explicate from particular kinds of socio-technological relationships? More recently, Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin have introduced the idea of the modern infrastructural ideal, again, looking to a particular kind of historical constellation between specific ideologies, scientific practices, the emergence of modern disciplines, for example, of urban planning, and also emergent patterns of consumption and territorial dimensions to the modern state. But I think that what many of these attempts to create a kind of periodization of these changes sometimes do is a tendency towards overgeneralization. And it's very clear that the closer we look at these changes, they're highly variegated, both geographically and also historically. So that particular, for example, constellations of science and medicine that coalesced around the bacteriological city towards the end of the 19th century were in practice very uneven in terms of their application to the rationalization of urban space. I want to consider then these interesting technological networks and their relationship to the production of space, just for a moment thinking about modern water infrastructure systems. And this is an image taken from Hilmar Bertel, which illustrates part of Charlottenburg in Berlin. Now, on the face of it, these technological systems appear to show some degree of universality in terms of technical design standards and spatial characteristics. But actually, they often hide starkly different types of social and political landscapes. So I think it's extremely interesting, for example, in the case of Berlin, we've seen some of the most sophisticated attempts to unravel the politics of inevitability around the neoliberal transformation of public services that scholars such as Matthias Naumann have written about very persuasively, where a citizens' movement has effectively taken control back of water supply. So these technical diagrams then often mask very different kinds of social and political changes or ferment beneath the cartographic surface, as it were. Also, I think they illuminate the fact that there are many paths of rationalization, as the philosopher Andrew Feenberg has called it. So I think that the next 10 to 20 years then are going to be extremely important in relation to technological politics and really perhaps getting away from some of the more overgeneralized accounts of these relationships in urban space. Another thing I think to point out in relation to the historical picture of these changes is that what the historian Mark Mazower, for example, refers to as the technocratic assurance of imperial modernism was in fact fairly limited in its scope. Even within the global north, it's extremely interesting that in the 1950s and 1960s, many homes were not actually fully connected to what we might regard as a sort of standardized infrastructure network. So in relation to water, for example, Camisoplatz in Kreuzberg in Berlin, in the 1970s, only a quarter of households had their own bathrooms. This now, of course, is one of the most heavily gentrified quarters of Berlin, but right up until the 1970s then, you see a much more variegated pattern of connection to infrastructure systems. And of course, within the cities of the global south, these fractured modernities are even more pronounced. more recently, thinking through the politics of infrastructure systems, it's interesting to me that in relation to the cities of the global south, we've seen the rise of what we might term bourgeois environmentalism or virulent political discourses in relation to the basic needs or citizenship needs of people in fast-growing cities. So these very pronounced divides which are bound to be a focus of complex and contested debate. So, for example, in Thane, which is just beyond the metropolitan boundary of Greater Mumbai, we have at the urban fringe some of the most concentrated battles over land, construction, access to water supply and other forms of urban infrastructure. We even have sort of luxury high-rise developments constructed which have no water supply. They're looking to the future and some future acquisition of water supply in the future. And there are many other examples that we can draw on. So what I really want to say then in relation to historical periodizations is I think a need to look at some of the fine-grained details of these changes, and also I think to be cautious about exaggerating the rate of recent change in relation to the past. So that, if you like, the more complex questions that were emerging, say, in the 1920s or 1930s, may be effectively blurred or erased within a sort of present-oriented analytical framework. So, to move on to the second theme I want to consider in terms of these different relationships or entanglements in urban space, and the question of metabolisms, which I think relates closely, I hope, to the focus of the workshop today. Clearly, we can find metabolic continuities with the past in terms of basic human needs or the scale and complexity of urban form, but it's really the question of how metabolisms have been conceptualized, which I think relates to a lot of the presentations we've had earlier and also hopefully to later discussion. So many of you will be familiar with the work of William Harvey on discovering the nature of blood circulation within the body in 1628, and how these notions of circulation gradually acquired greater metaphorical weight in relation to architectonic discourses in the modern city, particularly from the middle decades of the 19th century onwards. And really underlying these kind of questions was the possibility to conceptualize urban space as a set of identifiable organs and then map the city as a kind of organic machine. In the 20th century, some of these approaches become even more pronounced, so that we have the sort of extraordinary graphic art of Fritz Kahn, for example, Der Mensch als Industriepalast from 1926, related in turn to some of the international hygiene exhibitions of the earlier 20th century and new didactic approaches to communicating the functional aspects to urban space. And in the case of Kahn's work, which incidentally has been quite influential for science fiction literature, but there was a sense of presenting modernity as a kind of organic totality and technological utopia. But certainly as we move through the 20th century, we find in the middle decades, 50s and 60s perhaps, the zenith for scientific politics and an unproblematic Promethean ethos towards the transformation of cities and these spaces beyond, which are related to urban metabolism, exemplified by dams. This is the Garrison Dam from North Dakota, completed in 1956. Many, many other examples we can look at, but they really mark a particular juncture around techno-modernity that scholars such as Timothy Mitchell have written about in an extremely interesting way as particular manifestations of modernity associated with particular kind of techno-political apparatus of the modern state, but often equally having sometimes unintended or unenvisaged consequences, for example, through the spread of malaria in relation to dam construction in Egypt, and many other interesting examples. So in a sense, the limits to the control of nature also revealed sometimes behind these megalomaniacal or very complex or large-scale projects. Tim introduced this question of the cyborg, which is a concept which has intrigued me for some time now. And this of course, is closely associated with the work of Donna Haraway, who, in fact, to add a little bit more to the historical background to this concept, she gave a paper at a conference in the former Yugoslavia, which made its way into a German article in the radical journal Das Argument, operating out of West Berlin. And it was framed very much in the context of a new feminist approach to understanding technology. This was really the pretext for this particular critical intervention. And Haraway herself has become an anime character, just to add to some of the conceptual complexity of what she was originally talking about. But I do think that the notion of the cyborg, if we can disentangle it from a rather narrow focus on the technologically augmented individual human body towards an attempt to conceptualize urban space as a larger set of interdependencies and relationships, manifest, for example, through water technology networks or energy networks. This, I think, is where the notion of cyborg urbanization continues, I think, to have a potentially useful role to play in these discussions. But attempts to conceptualize urban space within the biophysical sciences have been very, very important, and this has been touched on already this morning, thinking about cities as ecological machines or urban systems. The Berlin School of Urban Ecology, exemplified by the work of Herbert Zukop, who some of you may be familiar with, remains an extremely influential body of work, but it's also important to remember that historically this was really intended as a provocation towards the anti-urban bias within much ecological thinking at the time. And of course these notions are not restricted to the case of Berlin, although it's extremely influential. Early 70s Brussels, Paul Duvigneau, the tropical ecologist, tried to apply many of his ideas to understanding the urban system, and he produced these, I think, quite remarkable maps, for example, if you see on the right here, showing the different times that trees would fall into bud or into flower to illustrate the urban heat island effect, these extraordinary cartographic representations of urban ecology, which for me are really very close to art. They move almost beyond science as conventionally conceived. But the notion of the city then as some kind of an ecological system amenable to analysis and control is of course extremely important within urban environmentalist thinking. So we have influential figures such as Herbert Geradet, but whose work some of you may be familiar with. But for me, I think this cataloguing or this approach to sort of an ecological inventory really hasn't really advanced much since the high points of technological approaches to urban systems in the middle decades of the 20th century. And in fact, when you look beneath the surface of some of this ostensibly radical ecological thinking, the prognoses are often rather trite or unimpressive. Geradet, for example, points out some interesting recycling schemes in parts of provincial rural Denmark and so on. This is not really world transformative stuff. Another strand, I think, which is also becoming increasingly interesting at the moment is the return to Lefebvre, and in particular trying to critically rethink the relationship between cities, whatever a city may be, as a particular form of urbanization, and urbanization itself as a broader structural spatial process, which I think is very much what Neil Brenner and Kristen Schmidt are currently trying to do with their planetary urbanization project. And looking at, for example, the relationships behind the urban process. So these diagrams, for example, showing water systems. This is one that I developed in relation to research in Mumbai, very familiar for a range of cities. It's worth pointing out that Mumbai has intriguing structural similarities with New York City in terms of its water supply system and the technocratic push to ever more distant sources in Maharashtra state, which is the size of Italy, incidentally. So there are these very complicated, interesting relationships that unfold through time in terms of this spatial dynamic. I think we can also introduce into this discussion around the relationship between space, technology, and cities, other very interesting work, for example, on technological zones that Andrew Barry has developed, where there is a distinct periodicity to the establishment of technological zones that link together questions around standardization technical compatibilities, regulatory competences. So in a sense, what we're looking at often is a combined biophysical and institutional type of landscape. So many interesting things to bring in. And his work, for example, on oil pipelines, very interesting in relation to the geography of infrastructure systems. And really then, just to think through where some of these dynamics might be moving, a couple of the presentations this morning have pointed out the significance of this, if you like, a political dynamic towards ever greater use of resources, and this sense of what Timothy Mitchell refers to as a limitless horizon of growth and how it actually intersects with urbanization processes. And it's interesting to me that in the case of water, the techno-modern impetus towards, for example, nuclear-powered desalination plants, for example, and the quest for what we might term unconventional water might be conceivably considered as a parallel technological and geopolitical maneuver to the extraction of unconventional oil and the hydropolitics of global capitalism. So some interesting analytical and material intersections there that we might want to consider, not least because, of course, with fracking, we have questions around the degradation and depletion of potable water sources. And in my final slide, some images here from Balcombe in West Sussex, just 31 miles from London. This placard on the left is intriguing because a British Conservative politician said that fracking's fine to go ahead because it can be in the desolate northeast, which is wrong on both counts because the sites in question are in the northwest and they're not desolate. There are millions of people who live there. And there's an interesting kind of spatial link between people from northwest England coming down to West Sussex to join together in opposition towards fracking. But this is just 30 miles from London. And it does occur to me that if fracking, for example, can occur in such a densely populated and actually quite an affluent area of southern England, then what hope is there for Antarctica or biosphere reserves or elsewhere within the planet? So to conclude then, I think three points that I'd like to make. Firstly, in relation to this whole question about metabolic pathways, we do need, I think, to think about the global diffusion of particular kinds of lifestyles and consumption practices that interlink with particular kinds of landscape transformations. To give a small illustration, the spread of non-agricultural irrigation systems for lawns, golf courses, and other opulent manifestations of semi-arid urbanization, which have in fact been looked at by some scholars within the urban political ecology field. I think a second thing which I've touched on in relation to water is the possibility of certain analytical commonalities between different relationships in space. And certainly within the framework of urban political ecology, one of the interesting questions is, water clearly has been very extensively studied. What happens if we want to extend some of these studies to other fields, such as air, for example, the interesting work of David Gisson and other scholars? So what are the other fields and what kind of analytical commonalities might exist? And also, what are the gaps or lacunae within urban political ecology or the first wave of urban political ecology? Are there different analytical approaches that we need to consider or to supplement this earlier phase of work that's been completed? And then finally, and I think this does relate perhaps to what Tim was talking about, the question of rhetoric or terminology. And mention has been made earlier of the sustainability paradigm. And it does occur to me that in terms of the kind of fields that we're talking about now, there's been this range of terms, if you like, have been transferred from specific fields of science to an urban design or public policy arena repeatedly with very complicated implications, ranging right back to the Chicago School and then more recently. And I think we do need to be extremely careful about how we use language and terminology in relation to what we're talking about, not least because of the so-called post-political debate and the evisceration of language into these relatively meaningless terms such as stakeholders and other obfuscatory euphemisms, I think, which actually occlude what it is we're really talking about. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
So thank you, team. We will have now half an hour of discussion that is going to be moderated by Professor Neil Brenner, director of the Urban Theory Lab.
So we've got a lot of time, which is nice. What a privilege to listen to this panel. This was really kind of a remarkable discussion, a remarkable series of presentations by really four of, I think, the most creative and innovative theorists and thinkers about kind of environment, capitalism, society, space. So this is really, I mean, I've read the work of each of these guys, but to hear all of you like right next to each other, really, really thought-provoking. And obviously there's a lot to discuss here, and there's lots of kind of profound methodological, conceptual, and maybe political disagreements among the panelists. But just as a way to like frame this before we kind of open it up for more general discussion, it seems to me that there's actually a lot of common ground in terms of what's been said. And I just kind of took some notes and made a list of four, what I think are sort of shared assumptions, which I might be wrong, but this is also intended to provoke discussion. So one, I think, common ground for each of our speakers is that basically this binarism of society, nature, just throw it out, like toss it. It's outlived its use, and we got to get rid of it, and it's obfuscatory. So I think they all in their own different ways basically want to just go beyond that. And again, in the broader global discussions of these issues, that's already a distinctive position, which is probably in the minority in terms of global public discourse. So we're already on a kind of particular conceptual terrain in terms of that divide, which, you know, in another kind of conversation, you guys would have to defend that position. But it seems to me that's shared ground. So that's one. Two, it seems to me in different ways, each of our panelists wants to historicize socio-nature. So they do that in different ways. They have different ideas about regimes, assemblages of socio-natural interdependence, and also different timescales. I mean, obviously, Jason's interested in sort of systemic cycles internal to capitalism, at least for purposes of what he said. Earl has a very, very long timescale. And there are other variants thereof in terms of, you know, Tim is obviously making comments about more, and Matthew as well, more recent kind of cyborg dynamics, but you have different timescales in your work as well. But there's a shared interest in the historicity of socio-natural regimes, or whatever the right vocabulary is, and in a way that already points to what I think is a third commonality, which is that they all, and this is a terrain of deep disagreement among them, but despite all the disagreement, they all insist that we need new conceptual vocabulary. And they're all developing that. I think they disagree profoundly, at least some of you do, about what the right vocabulary should be, but within the parameters of socio-nature and historicizing it, there's a shared commitment, and I think that commitment is also embodied in how this conference is organized, to start this thing up with a panel where it's like, okay, let's get clear about what the right theoretical and conceptual and cartographic framework should be for thinking about the problem. And I obviously deeply agree with that. We might disagree about what the solution is to that problem, but simply as a way of saying this is a problem that we need to wrestle with. The problems are not simply concrete and practical or political normative. Before you even do that, you've got to have an epistemological conversation about what it is that we're actually talking about. So I think that's, again, common ground. And the last one, which may be more specific, but it's at least a sort of thread of some of these presentations, is the question of how to understand our current moment of socio-ecological crisis. And I see a common thread among them. And again, even though I think in some ways Jason and Earl really profoundly disagree or just have divergent perspectives on certain things, this is an interesting, I think, shared thread in your work, and perhaps also shared by Matthew and Tim, which is they all criticize, it seems to me, a certain kind of eco-catastrophism that's based on an externalist model of nature. So that in a certain way goes back to the first point about going beyond the society-nature divide. So what I mean by that is that we might all agree that there's a kind of new set of crises associated with our environmental condition. But they all would insist that in order to understand those crises, we need to understand them as not external, based on some kind of purely ecological process, the limits of which we're now experiencing, but rather that process is internal to the particular organization of social, political, economic relations. And actually, I think that's common ground. Even though that wasn't as much a theme in Matthew's work, in Matthew's presentation today, or in Tim's presentation, from reading your work, I think that's a shared thread. So anyway, that's my attempt to just kind of frame this. In other words, whatever disagreements there might be, I think that those are like pretty specific positions in the global discourse about these issues, which our panelists actually kind of converge around. So what I propose, just as a way to maximize our opportunity for discussion, the way I always do this, and it seems to work well, is let's collect. Let's just open it up. Instead of letting you guys respond to what I said, let's hear what the audience wants to say. So let's collect a few. If you could kindly identify yourself in any way you wish, your name and maybe your affiliation. And then if the panelists just take notes, and then we'll turn it back over to the panel, and you guys can select which ones, or if you want to reply to all, then that's fine. Does everyone have paper, pens? Are you guys okay with that mode of proceeding? Yes. Kian, you have your hand up. Please, start with you. Take the mic.
Hi, my name is Kian Ga. I'm a PhD candidate in urban studies and planning at MIT, and also a member of the Urban Theory Lab. And Neil, I'm going to blow your framing a little bit, but so thank you all for super interesting presentations. And I wanted to say first that it's great to have folks like Maria Mies and Donna Haraway continue to get their due. And I want to flag this in a way. When we talk about urban metabolism, we are in large measure talking about the landscapes of power and inequality and oppression, structural oppressions. And it is great to have the expertise that we have on the panel. And it would also be good to be able to engage more directly, perhaps, with the voices and the folks that are actually being oppressed by some of these larger structural systems. So how can we get more directly the voices of women, people of color, poor people into conversations like this as we have them?
Thank you. And let's go to Hector in the back. If you could just kindly pass the mic back, we'll be a little more efficient that way. Let's just take a few more. Hector.
Hi, my name is Hector Charito Picard. I am a dual degree candidate for landscape architecture and urban design, and I'm also a member of the Urban Theory Lab. I guess my question relates to Jason and Errol specifically. About the metabolic rift. I think that it's clear that the mode of thinking of not separating nature and ourselves as humans as being part of that is something that I think that we're all on board. For me, my question is really, what do you foresee the future? Nonetheless, even though the way that we think about it, it's more integrated. I do still think that there is a rift between ourselves as human beings and what we produce and the ecology. So for me, the question is, do you foresee a future within the current economic system where that could be reconciled? And if so, how would you see it reconciled? The idea that nature can be commodified and be exploited. How would that be reconciled? And if not, what would be other models that we should consider?
Hi, I'm Damien White. I teach at Rhode Island School of Design. So thanks for the talks, very enjoyable. I want to ask a question about political agency. So clearly you're all coming from different disciplinary cuts, and you've got epistemological differences. Much of the talks, though, were primarily kind of descriptive and conceptual or analytic about urban metabolism in the age of the Anthropocene. But it could be suggested that what was shared amongst all the talk was not much engagement with or mentioning of agencies present in the construction of the Anthropocene. So agencies such as states, social movements, political parties, design forces, design politics more generally. And I suppose you know, I'm trying to struggle with the thought that, of course, all the specific cuts you're making are legitimate in the broad sense of generating knowledge. They've all got their individual legitimacy. But if we're interested in the question, you know, what kind of Anthropocene do we wish to create, then we have to kind of grapple with the question of political agency. So my specific question then would be, how is political agency facilitated by your particular mode of conceptualizing? So what is gained by your very disciplinarily specific cut into urban metabolisms of the Anthropocene? What do political agents get from your positions?
Should we take one more? I mean, that's already a pretty heavy load for them, but is anyone connected on this? Yes.
Yeah, it might be.
Please.
I had been rehearsing my question all week, and I forgot my notes, so I'm gonna have to play it by ear. So, like, very simply, there's a slippery slope where the normalization or the naturalization of capitalism might become an apology of capitalism. And I know, you know, you're not, and Kyle Moe is familiar with the question. I made it to him a few weeks ago. I know you're not climate change denialists or extreme social constructivists or anything like that. But outside academic circles, sometimes these, you know, the arguments presented here might be played as a defense of capitalism, as saying that capitalism is natural, it's just the way things are. It sometimes leads to, you know, capitalist realism, the idea that, as you briefly mentioned, the law of the economy is seen as inescapable as the law of gravity, the idea that the law of value is what ultimately defines what are the limits. So how do we avoid, you know, the cooptation of this position by the, you know, climate change denialists or the apologists of capitalism, whatever? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Let's turn it over to the panel. We've given them quite some work here. Should we just start on this side, or are you ready, Jason? We're always ready.
I'm always ready.
Cool.
Voices of the oppressed. I don't think I mean, I got my PhD at Berkeley in geography. Everybody was doing ethnography. And, you know, everybody's out there. Yes, we're going to go out and do field work and give those voices meaning and expression. The real question is, what do those mean? And then it hooks up with a question of agency that Damien, is that posed? So I would say the question, political agency or social agency, or are those even the right terms? In my view, well, what we've seen is, well, climate's an actant, or climate change is an agency. Climate is historical protagonist, in the words of the historian Bruce Campbell. So what we've seen with the question of agency is that it's been sorted into a Cartesian binary. So, disease has agency, even though disease only has agency insofar as it gets bundled up with humans, and particular sets of relations between humans, which are also relations with the rest of nature. So I would say agency is always bundled. I think we see a lot of good examples of this since 1968. I think the feminist and movements, I think the movements around sexuality are a good example. I think food sovereignty is what I would call a world ecological moment, because the food sovereignty family of movements, I wouldn't romanticize it, says food is not ecological, food is not social, it is all of the above. It is a question of meaning and life in all of the senses that we know, and that they're all intertwined with each other. So I would say there is a link to be made with the question of climate change and climate change denialism. Well, I think what we see on the left is a kind of climate fetishism. I think we see a certain fossil fetishism that's gone on. I think not because climate is unimportant, far from it. And in different talks, I will give much more time over to the centrality of climate change in our times. But climate change cannot be seen as an external force. It has to be seen as a co-produced moment of this civilization, and that the crises that climate change, bundled up with the rest of nature, including humans, induces, those crises are historically and geographically specific. And to be smart about the present conjuncture means to identify the points of fracture, the points of contradiction that are brought into play by climate change as what I would call world ecological phenomena. So that involves questions of labor and labor unrest, of food. We see the return of the food riot. We have all of these factors, but of course it's not independent of, say, financialization or the ongoing crises of late capitalist agriculture. And then finally, yes, of course, humans are alienated from the means of production, including the rest of nature, and the means, and increasingly the relations of reproduction. That's what happens under capitalism. I don't think that we need to posit an ontological condition where we're separated from nature. However, there is a historical condition where we take on a view of human exemptionalism, in the words of Cadden and Dunlap. And finally, I just have to note, is maybe we can continue this conversation, is that we have a crisis of the structures of knowledge. That we see this especially with the Anthropocene argument, where you have Earth system scientists who are real, and I love it that they're doing this. They're providing good knowledge about the Earth system, and they're trying to move into the terrain of historical change. And we have a crisis. We have a crisis of synthesis, where we don't have institutions that valorize the synthetic knowledge. Yep. And so that has to be reckoned with first and foremost, because I don't think that we are seeing disciplinary inflections here. I think what we're seeing is the breakdown of the two cultures in this panel. So I would say the opposite, the anti-disciplinary inflections of this panel.
Thank you. Matthew.
Okay, I'd like to have a go at questions 1 and 3, if I may, just briefly. Question 1 about landscapes of power. I think that if we begin to extend our analytical frame, for example, to aspects of environmental history and the critical role of environmental justice movements, then I think that's one important element. Also, by looking at the urban, I think that already begins to subtly alter the frame of analysis, and the categories such as natural are immediately brought into question in extremely important ways. And also on this question, that the science of ecology has a very complicated relationship with its own history and different ideologies. And part of the process, perhaps, of building a new conceptual synthesis is to look again in a much more rigorous way at the histories of ecology itself, which is one thing that I'm currently very much interested in. And then question 3 about political agencies. I don't agree, by the way, that it didn't feature in the discussion earlier. I think that just to perhaps link with some of the discussion that I was reflecting on around technological networks, and I think the Berlin case is very interesting, actually, in relation to taking back public services. There are certain important aspects here. I think there's the democratization of technological networks and bringing networks back into some form of public control. Also, questions of enriched citizenship and knowledge, because part of the pretext to enable this to happen in Berlin was to force the state and the corporate utility to release financial data and technical data that they refused to divulge. So the first step to a democratization of networks is actually access to knowledge as part of a building up of social movements. And also, linking with the work of Matthias Naumann, I mentioned, dispelling a sense of inevitability about certain patterns of urban policy and opening up different technological pathways. I mentioned the work of Andrew Feenberg. I think that's a really promising and important thing to reflect on.
All right, these are great questions for an ecologist who's got a very thin understanding, I think, of a lot of these deeper politics that are coming out here. And I have to say that from the point of view of this concept of landscapes of oppression, I mean, there's no question that the social systems that produce ecologies create different ecologies under different systems. No question about that. I don't have a clear understanding of how you would use that as a tool for understanding ecology better, but it's possible that it could work that way. I just don't have a deep understanding of that. So I'm interested in the prospects. Could you detect the ecologies of oppression, say? I haven't seen that. I've seen some work with that, but it's not something that I'm very familiar with. So it's a very interesting question I don't really have a good answer to, but I'm curious about it. This idea of Hector's idea of this remaining rift of humans and ecology. So I have to say I still see the connection as being very deep, but the relationship just always shifting. And of course, even at one time on Earth, we still have hunter-gatherers living on Earth. There's still some around. And their relationships with their natures and ecologies are very different than ours. There's all sorts of relationships like this. I think from the point of view of us kind of urban folk, one of the interesting things that I've seen is this idea of reconciliation ecologies. You were talking about reconciling ecology. And maybe a classic example is bringing back birds of prey and into the city and things like this. Ways of intentionally bringing nature back that is kind of special to urban people, that you don't necessarily see the same thing going on in other kinds of systems. But I think that we're producing all these ecologies through our social systems in all different ways, and all kind of at the same time. This idea of, yes, the agency issue with the way that, for example, I've constructed this vision of global ecology. I would love to get a direct critique of what I've done. I have to say, when I did it very much through the ideas of what do ecologists need to know about the way that humans have reshaped ecology. That was my mission, and I just did the best that I could. And I really didn't think about all these deeper political issues that might emerge from it. Some of them did come up, this idea of when you say that everything's been transformed by humans, does that mean anything goes? You know, all ecologies are just subject to whatever whim we have or whoever has, and that does come up with it. And I would say no more than it ever did. I mean, why would just because we've already changed things mean that anything goes all of a sudden? I don't see that. We still have social systems, and you still have to deal with these problems, and I don't think they're ecological problems. In fact, trying to attach our social problems too deeply with ecology, I think, just gets around the fact that they're social problems. Like my favorite example is, climate change is going to hurt all these people in Bangladesh, and because they have such a low-lying, landscape in their cities and all this, and it's like, well, actually, they're the worst off anyway. I mean, what does this have to do with climate? Why is climate come into this at all? Same with Katrina. Is this climate-driven environmental problem that the lower Ninth Ward went underwater? It's totally a social problem. Submerging it in a some kind of climate framework is just getting around the facts. And then the final thing is, I don't intend to make any defense of capitalism. So if it's there, it's innate and unintentional. And something that's been banged around a little bit recently with some people talking about these things is this idea of ecological pragmatism and even this another term, I don't know what people think of this, radical pragmatism, where the question is, what are we really going to do, not what is our theoretical construct. And maybe that trying to get beyond theory and just into action is a very shallow approach, but that's something that people are definitely discussing with this kind of thing. What can we just do rather than
I haven't taken my history and theory of urban interventions class. Sorry.
Next semester.
Tim.
Sure. I think I can take on some aspects of these questions. The first is, I agree with Matt that I think there is a politics in what we have said today. I know in my paper what I talk about in terms of sort of an economy which is tied to the consumption and accumulation of value through fossil fuels, mapping back down into the oil industry to Exxon, trying to trace out what's going on. People do try to see who's responsible for what, to the point that there are studies out that say Exxon is responsible for 3.2% of all greenhouse gas emissions from 1854 to 2010. Okay, it is possible to do those kinds of analyses. But then when we ask about where's the politics and what do we do, to a certain extent, my question is always, who's we? You know, the Anthropocene is not all humans. The we that created it was pretty much done by some we dominating all others in the we, and then using that power to reconstruct nature and society to serve their interests, and then when it's been made a mess, say, oh, we all did it. And I think that's you know, highly problematic in terms of the way this is constructed, but it is the way it's constructed. And much of my work is actually very much about the way that these ideas that circulate into politics from science in terms of sustainability, development, and whatnot, how they become vacuous, but in becoming vacuous also have become incredibly dense and politically mobilizable. And if you go back to where they earlier, how they begin in terms of their use in English, I think they betray a kind of bizarre quality to the way that they're used now, in terms of often sustainability was first understood as what was endurable. What could you suffer and survive, or what could you bear? And then to another extent of it is to what extent can you possess something, or do you grab it, or you keep it? So I think sustainability, to me, it has potentially, in its articulation, while it's supposed to help all of us, it's in fact a very conservative sort of concept about who's got what they got and how are they going to keep it. And if they share it at all, they're going to try and, you know, dress up around the edges the misery that other people have by making it a little green. I think, you know, that's extremely problematic. In terms of something beyond capitalism, you know, that's been on the political agenda for, 100 years for sure, you know, 150 years quite possibly. Many people would argue longer than that. But there has not yet been something that has challenged it. And in many ways, what got me interested in environments is how centrally planned economies have slightly different modes of the historicizing ecology than market economies. But what troubles me today is, to a certain extent, the complete naturalization of capitalism. Capitalism is being naturalized to the point that capitalism is colonizing you know, the seed stock of the planet. It is, you know, further constructing the monoculture of monocultures. It is, you know, putting property interests into our, you know, our DNA, plant DNA, animal DNA, etc., mapping the brain. The interventions of capitalism are going into our inner nature, into, you know, cognitive science, genetics, health sciences, the mapping of the body, the mapping of health, the connection of that in articulation to the larger economy, I think are something that is very problematic and does need to be contested. Finding a politics for that is often local, it's not fully politicized, and when it is politicized into our essentially, what could you call it, symbolic democracy, or you know, the Fox News discourse, or the CNBC approach to managing the economy, yeah, these things become very, very difficult to see as political moments, because it's oftentimes an argument within the propertied, educated, powerful, Western, however you want to understand that, elite, and what changes on the margin are they going to make. It's a sort of the debate of Davos man and woman about, you know, steering the planet.
Thank you, Tim. I'm just waiting for instructions from our. I think we have to stop for lunch. So everyone, thank you for a very interesting discussion. Please join me in thanking